Hi everyone, and welcome to this London Climate Action Week webinar, which is titled Pioneering New Ways of Investing at a Local UK Level to Reach Net Zero, which is very topical at this moment in time. And I'm joined by an illustrious panel of individuals and our keynote speaker, Zoe Nicholson. So Zoe, if I introduce you first, if you can just say hi.
Hi everybody, nice to meet you all. Nice to be here.
And we've got Will from the People's Postcode Lottery.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Robert Shrimp from Solar Schools. Monica from Thrive Renewables.
Hi everyone, welcome on this hopefully sunny Friday.
And last but not by no means least, Rupert from UK 100.
Good afternoon, everyone.
So yeah, thanks for logging on. And you know, it's, as we said, it's very topical at the moment. The UK government agreed some really robust targets around COP26 to meet net zero commitments. Recent reports have said we're kind of a little ways off track in terms of achieving those, and we need some sort of cohesive and decisive plans in place. And against this kind of backdrop, we've had obviously this cost of living crisis, which has been impacted with high prices around fuel, food, and increasingly high levels of inflation. So quite a challenging environment. So we've convened this panel today to discuss, you know, all the great things that are happening and how we can sort of accelerate, you know, some of these activities to really kind of get us back on track. But firstly, I'd like to come to Zoe Nicholson, who's the Green Party councillor at Lewis, to kick us off with a keynote about the fantastic initiatives that you've got underway in terms of how you're going to deliver on net zero. So
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks very much. It's lovely to be here. And I'm going to share a little bit of our experience. I'm leader of Lewis District Council. It's a council in the southeast of England, where we have, perhaps people know Lewis by its reputation over bonfire. Maybe you don't. And where we burn a whole load of fossil fuels in the form of fireworks every year to huge quantities, completely wrecking our air quality monitoring for our council every year. Anyway, moving on. So yeah, it's great to be here, but also it's a deeply sobering week, isn't it? Because the report from the Climate Change Committee really clearly shows us that if any of us were a bit sceptical about the government's commitments to net zero in terms of having actual plans to back up the rhetoric, then Lord Debden really didn't hold back his punches, did he? Using language like, you know, shocking gap between policy and action on insulation. Using language like current programs will not deliver net zero. I'd be a bit harsher, I suspect, Rachel, than you over your rather polite referencing to that committee, and it kind of makes it even more important, I think, that we recognise the context that we're operating in, and councils like ourselves, and there are countless councils all over the country, you know, Rupert's working with lots of them, who are leading the way in making sure that we engage our community and you know, doing what we can with what we have in the absence of some national policy. And you know, for me, our approach as a local authority has, and you know, I suppose as a leader in a local authority and as a community leader, I see that part of our role is to make sure that we bring together people, communities, the business sector, those people who've got creative ways of raising money, funding solutions, and finding the solutions together alongside the rest of our anchor institutions in local government, but also in the NHS. And our approach, I'm going to talk about 4 things that I think are really important in terms of how we approach this as a council. I could talk about a whole load of stuff, but in particular, I want to talk about how local authorities use of their financial power and purchasing power in partnership with others in order to really leverage support for other forms of investment in in action to address the climate crisis. And we do this in basically 4 ways. So one of them is about how you spend your money. The other is about using our financial covenant, what I would call our financial covenant, and our borrowing powers, and how we use that to support and leverage community action, how we use our assets, and in particular, those of us that have still got housing stock, how you utilize your housing stock. And then fourthly, perhaps a little grandiose title, and maybe I'll rethink this after we've had this session, is how we bring our kind of intellectual and problem solving approach to particular problems where there is really no obvious solutions, particularly in terms of the current regulations, in working together over particularly over energy and investment in renewables. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of those 4, everybody knows that local authorities spend millions, both in terms of revenue, but also capital, not just on staff, but on goods and services. And we absolutely must take the power back over how that money is spent. We have to know where that money is spent, first of all, and then make sure that it works to deliver to our local priorities, investing locally. So, local authorities have massive potential to do good in this area that I think is often overlooked. We work really closely in partnership with the Centre for Local Economic Strategy, who I think are really great on this. And one example of how we've done that is that we've worked on a procurement framework for modular housing schemes that that ensure the development of a pipeline of over 400 homes worth probably about 100 million, which then enables a whole load of councils to work together over the same procurement framework, making sure that when you build into that procurement framework your carbon reduction commitments that you're requiring from the supplier, in fair and just employment practices, which is a really important part of addressing the climate crisis. Without that, we will simply leave people behind, and it's simply unacceptable to do that. We bring together both value for money as well as trying to address the skills and workforce agenda. And then that's a bit of a highlight on some of the issues that we're working on in terms of procurement. The second area is what I would call using our financial covenant. So using our ability to borrow or to lend to others. So very recently we've been working with our own community-owned energy company, an organisation called Evesco, who have been developing a solar farm proposal. One of the tricky parts about doing that when you're a community energy company is the pre-planning stage. And how to finance the pre-planning stage, really massive problem. So we offered a loan, essentially, an at-risk loan. We built the legal way in which we can do that, which then will enable other local authorities to be able to do the same, because we've done the legal legwork on how you can enable that to happen. So we put up a small amount of money in the big scheme of things, 150,000, big amount of money to a community-owned company, which if it gets past planning, and slightly controversially, there's lots of residents who are not happy, with this particular proposal. So if it gets past planning, then it will Avesco will then raise funds as part of a broader community share offer. So in that way, we're trying to creatively think about how we use our money to move forward in that way. I could talk a lot about the third area, which is decarbonising our housing stock. I won't, and how we utilise our assets. There's lots and lots of potential in local authorities to be able to think creatively about how you decarbonise and use your assets creatively. And the fourth area, that I wanted to touch on is coming together with community organisations and community energy organisations to try and solve some really big problems. So we're working with an amazing partnership called Communiheat, which is based in our district. It's the people of a village called Barkham, alongside Avesco, alongside UK Power Networks, who are working out how to solve the problem of move a whole village off of its dependency on oil. This is a rural area. This is a very significant problem that could be replicated all over the country. And they've done all the legwork on mapping and archetype building with all of the residents, and are now seeking to, have understood the footprint of every property, but also are now seeking to work out, okay, so we understand what the state of the stock is in this village, and we also understand what it would take to get to net zero. How do we work creatively in an environment that actually regulatory and financially, there are very, very few solutions out there for how do you enable a mixture of private owners as well as council tenants, as well as landlords, to be able to ensure that they can do mass retrofit of the village and move forward. So we're stepping into a place of partnership in thinking about how to do that. Some of the solutions may resolve in local heat networks, and we can talk about some of the problems that come up around that, but that's one of the examples of, I think, of where local authorities like ourselves have a role to play in thinking through how do you enable the funding of this to work properly. So I'm really curious about where we go to in this next conversation, to learn a bit about what are some of the other routes to solving the funding issues there. And my experience of working and leading a council and working in this space is that actually what it takes is fantastic partnership working and creativity and a bit of resilience that simply doesn't exist in other places. So I'm really excited to be here to hear the conversation going forward. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Zoe. That's brilliant to hear about. How you're driving the net zero agenda forward at Lewis, and community energy is something that's sort of close to our hearts at Ethex, which is the platform that I work for, and in my haste forgot to mention that. So thanks for that keynote, Zoe. So now we'll move on to the sort of panel discussion, and just a bit of housekeeping. There's several of the organisations here, kind of Scalable Schools and Thrive, that have current share offers that we'll kind of mention. Just to say, none of the information here should be taken as financial advice, and that these investments, your capital is at risk and returns are not guaranteed. That said, it's good, we'll now get into an interactive discussion about some of the solutions that we're sort of working on. I'd encourage all the people that are watching and have logged into the webinar to submit questions to the panelists. Just kind of send them through in the chat functionality. We can pose those questions as we go along, but I'm going to kick things off and go to Rupert and say, Zoe's talked about some brilliant things that they're up to in terms of their local authority, but how are you working with a more diverse base of local authorities to help them deliver on net zero? What does that look like for your organisation? How do you build capacity? How do you share knowledge? It'd be great to find out kind of your focus, Rupert, and how you're helping to support local authorities drive forward the net zero transition.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, we're a network of 103 local authorities that have committed to reaching net zero by 2045 at the latest, which is 5 years earlier than the current government target. I'd say we're not strictly a capacity building organisation. Our main focus in lots of ways is advocacy towards government about the structures and support, regulatory and policy terms, and also critically for this conversation, access to finance, which is going to facilitate ambitious local authority action. A place-based, there's a recent publication from UKRI, which is a piece of PricewaterhouseCoopers research that demonstrates that the benefit from a place-based transition to net zero, in which local authorities are critical, delivers vastly more social benefits than one that's place agnostic. And I think that the access to finance and the support for ambitious local authorities like Lewis District Council, of which Zoe's the leader, so a member of UK 100, how they can access finance to actually drive the agenda forward locally with the kind of partnerships that Zoe talked about is critical for us. And I think the thing that for me, and I think for UK 100, that's vital, is there's some really good things that have come from central government. The UK Infrastructure Bank that is in the process of being launched at the moment, one of their key focuses is around net zero. And there's a great place where things that previously local authorities wouldn't have been able to access more riskier funding over, it gives them the opportunity to do that. But I think the critical component of that, the sort of thing that Zoe was talking about at the very beginnings of a project, about how you actually finance putting together a proposal and understanding how you access that finance, have the capacity to do it. And also as a local authority that's accountable to voters, how you do it in a way that is equitable. And so you end up in a financial arrangement with a lender, which actually is appropriate and fair and actually serves your community well in the long term. And I think there are really huge issues around that. I think there are positive signs, but I think that seed money, that development capital issue, is a really critical component in all of this. And I think I'd like to say one other thing quickly to leave space for other people, is I think the other thing that's critical around this with the local authorities we work with, and I think this is very true cross-party, is how you retain the local economic benefit of the transition. So if you're making a transition, there are skilled jobs that are available in that transition. There are industrial strategy issues that affect regional government as well as some local government. And I think that the way that you access finance and the way that development goes, and the way that some local authorities have been very shrewd about using their further education. In Wiltshire, they have, which is a member of ours, they've trained the engineers to do the retrofit in their own FE colleges. And it's just like a fantastically creative step from a local authority. But what it also does is it retains those jobs in Wiltshire to drive that retrofit of homes. And I think there's like a critical component there that's very entrepreneurial, as Zoe said, and it's about linking those things together. And I think right at the heart of that is the actual capacity of local authorities that we know under the inflationary pressures that the LGA raised this week to government at the LGA conference, where budgets are really constrained for local authorities, in order for the UK to make this transition in the most effective way possible, with the most social and economic benefits to the country. A critical component of that is enabling local authorities to have the capacity to make effective evidential choices in terms of accessing finance to make that transition happen with their communities.
Thanks, Rupert. There, some really valuable and interesting points. Definitely the kind of place-based transition and social, economic and environmental benefits you talk about being really important. I mean, Robert, if I come to you next, I think certainly for schools, it'd be great to hear more about your organisation, how you're dealing with some of the challenges that, and the important elements with local authorities that Rupert's just raised, because I think you're a fantastic example of working with different authorities in and around the UK to deliver some of these kind of local benefits and access to finance and kind of social environmental benefits. So if I can hand that over to you and talk a bit more about all the great stuff that you've been doing over the past few years and your current race to do more.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind introduction. I'd love to pick up on a couple of points that Zoe and Rupert made, but just briefly on solar for schools, it kind of says what we says on the tin, but we help schools go solar so that we can use the solar panels to fund sustainability, energy and decarbonization education to the students. And that's the real key piece. Decarbonization from solar on schools in the UK, you could probably put about 2 gigawatts of solar on schools in the UK, about 26,000 schools. But the carbon intensity of the UK grid is actually quite good. So the CO2 savings per school is sort of 16 to 30 tons a year. But the impact of those students understanding what's possible and what needs to be done is far, far, far greater. If those students go home and persuade their parents to switch to an electric vehicle, fly less, switch to a green electricity supplier, or get involved in setting up a local community energy group to develop more solar, that impact's far, far, far greater. The issue is that in most of the world, less so in the UK, but most of the world, governments don't have the money to fund that type of education. So we use the solar panels to do that. And we started in the UK, we've got about 70 schools, I think it's nothing, 70 schools in the UK so far that we've funded and developed. We fund them through a community benefit society, which is actually where the members themselves are the schools. So it's a very fair system. The profits that build up after the bondholders have been repaid go back to the schools. So there's that local feeding it back to locally. Although the organization is UK wide, the profit share goes back to the individual schools that are members of it. So I think the local component piece is really, really important. We work very closely with a number of councils. It's been quite difficult to work with councils because of the way councils historically have had to operate. That's changing, which is great news. And I was delighted to hear Zoe's point about fantastic partnerships with creativity, and absolutely key. We need to work with councils very closely in terms of helping them with their internal decision-making process and their very restricted and limited capacity in some cases. And some of the lessons we've learned in other countries too, we operate in Germany and India, and we're about to launch in 2 more countries, is that councils have certain hurdles they have to go through in terms of procurement, but sometimes those procurements have been designed for buying capital equipment rather than entering into long-term financial agreement. And that's quite a challenge. And the financial agreement, comparing apples to apples is a major challenge. And we've developed a whole lot of software and tools to make it easier for our partners or our councils or the trusts or the community energy groups we work with to compare options and optimize the right size of solar PV for their school and try and find the best combination of funding options, a combination of grants and crowdfunding through Ethex, which we've been working with for years and are a great partner. In fact, at the moment, our fundraising on the Ethex platform is going a little bit too fast, so I'm not actually very keen on promoting it because we've got some challenges with some of our projects that were meant to be built this month, but are not getting built this month because the Secretary of State has decided that they didn't like what we're doing, even though the Department for Education has already approved it. A whole bunch of lawyers have already approved it, but this is the kind of challenges we have. So our biggest challenge is the time it takes to go from a school going or school students going, we want to have solar on our school. Some of our projects are student-led. We actually developed a mobile app to allow students to develop a project on their own school that was just funded by UK Innovate, which is great. And but developing the projects is a relatively easy piece. Getting all the legal approvals and going through all the hurdles is unbelievably complicated, and the government is making it even harder, even though we have a structure where the schools are ultimately indirectly owning those assets without having any liabilities attached to them. I don't know how much better we can make it than that, but they still seem to throw more hurdles in our way. So we could somehow overcome that, and we have been working with the Department of Education for some time to try and persuade them to come up with either a standard legal agreement and a standard process that is easy for people to check up on. So it doesn't have to go through the council's legal team, who then sometimes takes 3 months and wants another £3,000. Doesn't have to go through the DFE every time. It doesn't have to go through Secretary of State approval, which takes another 3 months. And that comes back to the other challenge, and I'm sort of probably going off on a long one here, but the other challenge we have is funding, and I think Zoe touched on that. It's funding the whole development process, because us or any other community energy group or any other organization in this space typically only earns an income once a project is completed, but you have to spend possibly 2 years developing that project. And if we're trying to develop not just 50 in parallel, but 500 in parallel, we need to somehow fund that. And that's a major challenge. And now I could raise the money to do that if I had a solid pipeline, but the pipeline keeps getting wobbly because a council or the DFE or the Secretary of State puts another hurdle away. So that's the biggest challenge for scaling up. And then one other point I want to touch on is capacity building. And I think there's a huge opportunity to encourage more young people in schools to move into this sector, because one of the biggest challenges we're going to have is not funding. The money is there. There's plenty of money. We've got lots of funds who would like to invest in these infrastructure assets. But the challenge is going to be capacity. In Germany, we're seeing that already. Installers are booked up a year in advance. And that's going to happen in the UK pretty soon too, unless we can build capacity. So I think the example that Rupert gave, where councils are actively involved in trying to help young people or engineers train up in these sectors, is going to be a key point if we want to hit any sort of target in the next 15 years. Sorry, that was a long preamble. Thank you though for the introduction.
No, thanks, Robert. No, that's great, and yes, some really valuable points, especially about skills and lack of the skills that we'll need in the future. Monica, I mean, Thrive Renewables have been around for a while, kind of really pioneering a lot of projects throughout the UK and renewable energy projects, and you've got an exciting investment raise looking to accelerate your growth. I mean, what's been Thrive's experience in terms of getting those projects off the ground locally, access to skills, and what would you say, how can you accelerate your growth, and what are some of the key sort of opportunities and challenges for you?
Yeah, thank you for this. It's great listening to the previous speakers talk about some of the issues, because I kind of recognize them, not always in the same context. But so yeah, just for background, then Thrive Renewables is 28 years now, which is amazing. And just reflecting on this, when we started, probably less than 2% of UK electricity was coming from renewables. Now it's sort of around 40%. So it's great to have seen this kind of growth, but we need so much more, and we need also heat transport and so on. So we're kind of looking at very quickly doubling or even tripling the UK's electricity demand. So in terms of that growth, there's so much to be done. And same as previous speakers we're saying, very much think that the local communities kind of need to take part of, be part of that transition and not being left behind. As we're speaking about these kind of projects, smaller projects, there is a whole thing going on where developers are just going for massive projects right now, sort of 500 megawatts solar and per project, and huge offshore projects happening. So, which is great, we need that, but it's about how we make sure that smaller side, the smaller scale, can also participate, and communities can play a role in that transition. Interesting with Robert, you were talking about the challenges you have on with the solar rooftops and getting permissions from councils and so on. I actually see quite similar things happening on the commercial rooftops. So there isn't any, government or local council sort of involved in procurement is not as, stringent, but still it's so hard to get people over the line. And sometimes, a lot of those legal challenges where you need permissions of, the rooftop owner is different from the rooftop, from the user of the PPAs and so on. So these kind of PPA issues are still huge, and it's just sometimes those small projects take just as much work as bigger projects. So it's about finding that, how can we scale up that kind of almost as a cookie cutter approach on these things. So as Thrive, we're looking at trying to find those kind of things on the smaller and the sort of mid-sized project. one example of a project we recently done, which I am very excited about, and I wanted to share as a case study, is the Ambition Community Energy project in Bristol. It's a project which was developed by local community. They came up with the idea they want to own a wind turbine. It's a very, I would say, less kind of advantageous part of Bristol, where people just feel like they've been left behind for a long time, and they feel that owning a wind turbine would give them potentially access to sharing benefits from that wind turbine. So came up with the idea. They got together a group of volunteers to help them go through the planning. And the planning was challenging with actually the council, with the local authority. They ended up going to the national level, even though it's a single turbine. They were successful. They got planning, and they achieved financial close just three months ago. And Thrive was one of the funders that helped them to fund the acquisition of the turbine. But just to say that we in terms of how we approach projects, we try to be innovative and think how to be collaborative, how we structure finance. So in this case, they didn't have PPA yet in place, but the costs are rising very much for turbines, and they're really keen to very quickly sign the contract. So we've kind of agreed with them. We will go ahead on funding the project and almost bridge them. So that's going ahead, and then they can take time to think about their PPA and their fundraising and everything else they will do later on. So yeah, that kind of bridging phase is quite good. So they've got that finance, and I think going forward for Thrive and looking at projects we want to focus on is finding those models for community projects, for the developers that want to work with communities as well, and also we are looking at the development finance. We understand there's a huge challenge funding those projects from the idea to planning. So we are looking at ways how we can also help with that. It's a question with this PPA power
Yeah, I
purchase.
was going to say, Monica, yeah, the jargon's in, so yeah, if we keep
So every project will need an agreement to sell electricity, and it could be electricity selling to grid, but also often would be, if it's possible, trying to connect to local off-takers. So it could be schools, like Robert was talking about, or it could be factories that use electricity as well. So it's those power purchase agreements that we're using. Okay, sorry, keep rambling.
No, thanks, Monica. So you talked about the important role of PPAs, power purchase agreements, and bridging finance, and getting projects, especially the new one in Bristol, off the ground. And then, I mean, if I come to you, Will, about the sort of unique role that people's postcode lottery is playing in trying to catalyse finance. And the panel talked about partnerships, and certainly we at Ethex have been lucky enough to work with people's postcode lottery to kind of invest in some great community organisations alongside retail investors to accelerate the finance that's needed. But it'd be great to hear from you about kind of how you think that finance is catalysing. What are some of the other approaches you're taking in terms of seed funding, and how you're helping to fill that finance gap at People's Postcode Lottery?
Thanks, Rachel, and some really great points made that hopefully I'll build on. Briefly, just as an overview, so players of People's Postcode Lottery have been helping support charities and good causes throughout Britain and beyond since 2005, and our mission is to help raise funds for charities and good causes and increase awareness of their work. And so far, players have raised over £900 million for 9,000 good causes. As an external lottery manager, we operate society lotteries on behalf of 20 postcode trusts, including Postcode Innovation Trust, which is where the relationship is with Ethex. So we are committed to supporting charities and social enterprises to create lasting social and environmental change. And funding raised by our players will help leverage the funds raised on Ethex's crowdfunding platform to deliver this impact to communities. And so Ethex were awarded a £500,000 grant in 2020 through the Social Investment Programme in order to provide that match funding. And when the repayments are made, they will be recycled into further investments to create further impact. And as of March 2020, my stats show that about £380,000 has already been invested. And that match funding helps to leverage additional investments from individuals, roughly £7 of individual investment for every £1 funded by Postcode Innovation Trust. So what appealed to us about this type of funding? Well, it allows our funding to go further, as it stimulates investments from the crowd, encouraging community involvement and ownership in projects that are usually just reserved for funders or banks, whilst also recycling those payments into further investments. And it allows us to invest in a wide variety of social enterprises and allocates funds at a smaller level than our programs currently offer. And so examples include, I think we've been touched on Bristol already, the Bristol Energy Cooperative, which was a £10,000 grant focusing on increasing the low carbon energy supply in Bristol throughout projects such as micro hydro power station, solar roof installations, and community grids. So beyond this particular relationship with Ethex, there are other innovative models that we have. We have a blended finance model. An example recently was a 50% grant, 50% loan to RSPB up in Lochleven, of £250,000, and that's in its early stages of a program, and so there's hopefully plenty more in the pipeline. Although we understand some of the capacity building and delivery mechanisms holding back some of that pipeline. And in a very new and emerging focus, we are in the process of finalising a revenue participation loan with a conservation organisation to create a carbon offsetting scheme using lowland peat. So this is a local focus combining both biodiversity and carbon. And the 60% loan portion of the funding will be repaid as a percentage of the income the enterprise produces above a certain target, reducing the risk to that charity. And so that income will make the charity more financially resilient and help in its core aim of delivering environmental improvement, conservation, and improved biodiversity. Now, some of the earlier speakers were talking about particular community energy investments. And so if we consider grants as an investment towards long-term change, I'm really pleased to share the work that we have been doing with Forum for the Future on their Power Paired initiative over the last couple of years. And this is to empower communities to make a just transition to a zero carbon economy, I should say. We know community energy is that low cost way of taking practical action on climate change. Yet some of the challenges can be found in terms of biggest barriers being finding a willing asset owner. So the owner or operator of land or buildings that could host a community energy project. And then for asset owners, their biggest challenge is finding a group to work with when they don't have the time or expertise to get projects off the ground. And so over the last couple of years, we've had over 100 community energy groups registering on the platform. And in addition, over 44 different asset owners with more than 110 assets suitable for community energy projects, including land, churches, offices, fire station, and schools. And the number of extra matches between those asset owners and community groups has whittled down to 44 expressions of interest, leading to 26 matches. And so I think that's really interesting platform in terms of that we touched on the notions of capacity building and platforms to support the whole ecosystem and infrastructure that is required. And then a very specific example, and it's great hearing from Zoe on the work taking place in Lewes in Sussex, is a partnership that we have through our funding with Friends of the Earth. They have something called the Near You platform, which combines various data sets, public available data sets, and they have a published methodology where you can put in your postcode or your town that you live and have an overview and assessment of the progress towards energy efficiency, implementation of heat pumps, or renewable energy power generation. And this is a really powerful new tool that can be used both by campaigners and local organizations themselves to have an insight into that progress being made, but also is intended to be used by the officers or the councillors themselves of those local authorities.
Brilliant, thanks, Will. Some fantastic things that you've been up to, and I must admit I hadn't realised how far Power Pairs had got. So I'll put the URL in there. But that's fantastic information sharing partnership service that they provide. So I'm conscious we've got some questions that are coming in. So I think the first one that I'll sort of put out there is how can local groups gain the green skills, set up green businesses to access supply chains of councils of long-term local business strategy? So I'm not sure who's best to, Zoe and Rupert, do you want to take that? Zoe first.
Although it feels like a Robert community engagement question. Sorry. I mean, I can, but it feels like a.
Okay, what was the question?
So I was just scrolling down. It's about how can local groups gain green skills, set up green businesses to access supply chains of councils, setting up sort of long-term local business strategies.
I guess it depends a little bit what they mean by green businesses. What we're doing with Community Energy England is trying to provide our tools to community energy groups so that they can assess the viability of a school. So if you go along to our website, you can look up any school in the UK and see its potential. You can use a very simple tool to basically lay some panels on it, which students now do via our app or our website. And when those community groups want to engage, and if they want to engage with us, we can then hold their hands and walk them through the process of doing that. So that's one way that we can sort of share what we've learned and the hurdles along the way of trying to get a project across the line. And actually working with community energy groups in that partnership model is quite effective because they can sort of do the local lobbying and persuading effectively, and we can provide the sort of essential resource to sort of save them having to sort of recreate a financial model for the upkeep time and reinvent the wheel and a whole thing they don't need to do. So I think finding someone to partner with is one of the ways that they can upskill. I think the next question, access supply chain of councils. That the supply chain on councils is a trickier one. I know councils are very keen on procurement frameworks, which makes sense on the one hand, and I can see why you're buying a commodity, it makes absolute sense. It's a little bit harder on solar because it's a very sort of custom built thing. The components are standard, but the final system size is very specific. I didn't think I can really answer that question. I think the generic question is reach out. There are a lot of people out there already doing it. Join a local community energy group and find some partners to learn from. Yeah.
If I can just quickly, oh, sorry.
So Rupert and then Monica. Rupert, do you want to come in and then I'll come to you, Monica?
I just want to make a point that there are a vast amount of large private companies that are desperate to invest in this space. And there is a huge skills shortage. And so for community groups who want to be a little bit entrepreneurial and partner with the right organisations and seek some of the sources of funding that are available to them that Will and others have highlighted, there is a huge space there for them to try and occupy. And I think there is a huge opportunity. I think just as there's a barrier for some of the private companies, there is a skills shortage. And I think that's as difficult for a large multinational to overcome in this space at the moment in some ways as it is for a community group. So I don't necessarily see this as a hurdle for a community group. So I would just say there is a big opportunity. And if you're brave enough to be entrepreneurial in your community about it, then I would urge you to take that step.
Thanks, Rupert. Monica, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry for jumping in, but yeah, I just two points on this. So recently went to the Community Energy England. There's a community fortnight happening, which is 2 weeks of events on community energy, and they had a big conference 2 weeks ago in Bristol. And I was amazed with the breadth of types of projects communities get involved in. Such complex, energy systems and EVs and demand side management, and very complex kind of looking at how we data capturing, and I was absolutely amazed. So I think if you looking at things, there's already projects happening all over the place, and as you mentioned, I think it's really worth looking at who is it, and people seem really happy to share knowledge as well. And in terms of the communities having an advantage, I see that also on the commercial side. So the likes of various supermarkets or other kind of factories, businesses, they like to work with communities. So if a community group would provide them with a solar kind of panels or things, then it also helps them with just their engagement with communities. So I think if you approach it in the right way, community energy does have a huge role and advantage in kind of accessing these various business opportunities.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything further on the skills shortage? Or if not, then there was a question specifically for you, Zoe, on blended finance. So with the different activities that Lewis Council got involved with, did you employ blended finance structuring approach in any of your financial designs?
Well, in a way, one of the work that we're doing with Evesco on the solar farm is a form of blended finance, because if it doesn't go through planning, we don't see the money back, the money spent. But going forward, we're also exploring how we leverage our own cash into and alongside green bonds or community-owned bonds, or lots of other different ways of doing that. So the short answer is yes. The kind of longer answer is yes, and some of this space is quite, and people around this table will know that better than me, is quite technically difficult. But again, some creativity and not reinventing the wheel, like Robert's talked about, not reinventing the wheel over legal agreements is such an important part of not spending months and months and months delaying things when somebody else has already done it, is a really important something that I'm going to pick up from this, Robert, is to pick your brains about how we do that.
And Robert and Monica, on blended finance, I mean, you're accessing finance from all sorts of different sources. So any comments from you on kind of blending structures and what works, Robert, and then I'll come to Monica.
Yeah, so last year, when there were no more subsidies and electricity prices were still reasonable, it was quite difficult to make the economics work. So most of the projects we did last year were together with Leeds County Council, who got a PSD2 grant for decarbonisation. So they put heat pumps in and then used some of the funding to then cross-subsidise the solar panels to bring the PPA price down to a point where long-term the cost of operating the heat pump wouldn't be greater than operating the gas boilers. So they funded about 75 to 80% of the solar, and we funded the rest through Ethex. And so that was a really good example of enabling together to put, in one school, we put enough solar to provide pretty much 95% of the total energy requirements of the school over the period of a year. Obviously, summer, winter, there's a big challenge. So that's one example. The other example is we've been looking and talking to corporates who want to somehow get involved from a CSR perspective. They love the idea of donating a system to a school, and without realizing that donating a system to school causes a number of problems. One, the school doesn't really appreciate it, and when it breaks 2 years later, no one's got a budget to fix it. And two, every other school then goes, oh, look, they're donating systems. I won't enter into a PPA. I'll just wait until someone donates one to me, which there's not enough corporates out there to donate one system to every school out there. And typically they tend to be quite small systems. So what we've been working with is an idea whereby they put a certain amount of money into the CBS. And so a certain amount is donation and the rest is then funded through Ethex. And that works very well where on smaller projects where the economics just simply don't stack up. Secondary schools, you could probably make every secondary school in the UK work with a PPA, the school would save money. Last year, small schools just couldn't. So combining a corporate donation, potentially in exchange for a carbon offset, is something that we're currently exploring. We've got 2 law firms who've given us their time to develop such a carbon offset. It's going to be particularly useful for funding projects in other countries where the carbon intensity is much, much higher, and therefore the impact of those carbon offsets is much, much greater. And this brings up a massive ethical question, actually, which is, the last 20% of carbon in the UK is going to be very, 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 very expensive to get rid of. Yeah, if you spent that last 20% anywhere else in the world, you could probably spend a quarter of it and offset twice as much carbon. Yeah, the example I give is for every pound invested in solar in the UK, you could achieve 10 times the CO2 savings if you invested in India, right? So that's kind of a question. At what point do you go, well, actually, we shouldn't be focusing on decarbonizing the last 20% of the UK. We should be focusing on decarbonizing the world. And where do you invest? And that becomes quite interesting because people like to invest locally. It's very easy for us to raise money for schools in the UK. It's much harder for us to raise money to invest in schools elsewhere. Anyway, so that was a couple of points on blended funding.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Robert, and I'll make a shameless plug for Ethex's sister platform, kind of Energize Africa, that does, kind of exactly what you're talking about, looks at impacting investing from emerging economy perspective. But Monica, kind of blended finance structures, kind of what approaches do you take from Thrive's perspective?
Mm-hmm. I mean, as I said, trying to have a very much collaborative approach to finance and find the right structure that works for a project. So yeah, we've got projects where we've provided just 100% equity and we just own these projects outright. We have projects where we have done joint ventures with the landlords or with community groups, and we jointly own projects. And also done structures where we provided just debt to projects. So we don't have any ownership. So either as a mezzanine debt or just bridge loans, where we just have, it's just a loan and the community, that's usually good for community groups in terms of that sort of structure. Over time they can pay us back and own the project and pay benefits to their communities. I guess out of those, I would pick up on the joint ventures. There is a lot of big projects happening right now where developers are, as I said earlier, developing huge schemes on onshore wind, solar, and so on. And I think there's a real opportunity for community groups to be part of those schemes and just have joint ventures with developers. And I think there's a real opportunity there. And the developers we're speaking with are interested in those kind of schemes as well, because for them, that gives them that kind of local context. Also helps them on the planning side, to make sure that they're also bringing community alongside them. So these are very, very interesting models, and we're also looking at ways that how we can support funding for in those kind of situations for community groups.
Thanks, Monica. So there's a question on planning, and then I'm just going to give each of you a heads up because I'm conscious we've got 7 more minutes. So if I can come to you about one of the points we're discussing before the webinar started, kind of what do you see as kind of one of the main ways in which sort of centralised UK government policy could help accelerate some of these initiatives? And I'll come to each of you shortly. But on the planning question that John sent in, Mullin, I'm just wondering, it's probably Zoe or Robert, I guess, or possibly Monica. Planning's a huge issue, getting heat pumps in conservation areas, solar panels, all of these should be waived. How can we move the agenda forward? So yeah, really quickly, what are the transformational things we can do from a planning perspective to ease the process and the burden? Robert?
I'm not probably the right person. It's funny, planning has become, when we first started doing solar on schools, there was permitted development under 50 kilowatts, and that was pretty easy, you just sail through. The thing is that module efficiencies have improved by 50% roughly since then. So that same amount of space is now 75 kilowatts, yeah? So I now have to get planning permission. So the planning permission rules need to be updated to reflect. They haven't really kept up with the time. So I think there's a central situation where, generally speaking, the guidelines need to be updated. There's a situations where there was one school we were putting some solar panels on it, and the building next door had bats in it. Fine, But we had to go through and do a VAT research because we were putting solar panels on the building next door. And you know, a bit of common sense would have probably said, actually, don't need to do that. Yeah, and okay, it cost £500 and took 3 months. Yeah, so I think a bit more common sense and a bit more maybe leeway applies. Now, solar panels on schools, generally people don't complain, and it's not normally a problem. It's just a cost and an extra hurdle. If it could be made easier, fantastic. The biggest hurdle, though, to us is still the legal teams in councils, not the planning teams. Yeah.
Okay,
That's
so
the solar.
that's one of the barriers. Zoe, and then Monica, quickly on planning. Any insights?
I mean, just to make a broader point, that our planning system is fundamentally broken, and what's proposed in terms of planning reform, I don't think addresses this issue in the slightest. And you know, if you think about some of the broader injustices, you know, I heard I'm pretty sure it was Lord Debden speak about this, that you know, the fact that we still have you know, we're fine with wind farms so long as they're in the sea, but it's not okay to have a wind farm, you know, on ground, and that it takes 10 years to do one out at sea, but it takes a week to erect one on land, is just ridiculous. So, you know, there are so many things about the planning system, and, you know, we have to lobby government, and also, you know, think about who you vote for, really. That's, you know, fundamentally some of the issues at play.
Brilliant, thanks, Zoe. And Monica, any further points on planning? Or
I don't think I can add anything more. I agree with everything you say. We just had our AGM, and you know, it's getting boring. 28 years, keep telling our shareholders, you know, planning and grid, it's just so frustrating. So yeah,
it's still an issue after all those years.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, if I can come to each of you about kind of sort of centralised government policy, and what's the one or two things that would help accelerate these local solutions. Will, can I come to you and get your view?
Sure, Rachel. So as a funder of civil society organisations and charities, we can support those advocacy measures for policy changes for a more positive environment and carbon reduction systems in place, and beyond advocacy, those practical delivery mechanisms, capacity building that we've touched on, and so we are able to provide flexible funding to the majority of our charity beneficiaries, and so able to encourage those who are in receipt to engage with civil servants and government on a sort of a positive and sort of collaborative way.
Brilliant, thanks, Will. Rupert.
Yeah, I think that, speaking to the planning question again, actually, and I think it's the critical moving part, is the Levelling Up Bill is making its way through Parliament at the moment. And at the moment, there isn't a strong relationship in that bill between net zero and climate more broadly and levelling up. And I think that the critical thing to do is to pressure government on the alignment of those two issues. And that if we're going to see those broader social and economic benefits from net zero, they're right at the heart of making levelling up work. And that's very much around the planning system as an enabler of those things happening.
Very, very interesting points. Thanks, Rupert. Monica.
Yeah, on planning more.
On just policy, government policy, centralised government policy. What would help accelerate kind of some of the projects that you're working on in the local solutions?
I think we can. I should probably bring up grid as another challenge. With tripling our electricity needs, and so will have to be our system bigger by then. We already seeing projects with 2029 grid delivery date. So is there anything we can do on a kind of on that government level that can also support that infrastructure? Yeah, so I think the great thing about last year, we saw a lot more planning applications for new projects, which is great. But then yeah, that's great. But if these projects are delivered in 10 years, it's not quick enough, right? We need to be more ambitious. So yeah, grid is becoming an issue. So it's always been an issue, but it's really accelerating right now.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, that's very important in terms of grid infrastructure. Roberts, and then finally Zoe.
So we're fortunate to have on the CBS board, we have Julian, head of development of the national grid, and he joined us because a school we did when subsidies had disappeared was the first school ever to pay more for a solar price than it paid for mains. And when we asked the school why, they pointed us to Julian, who was one of the governors at the time, and he said, look, it's obvious that electricity prices have to go up massively because we're going to have to invest billions in upgrading the grid, and that's going to have to come from somewhere. So the national grid is aware of the massive challenge ahead of them, but it really is billions that need to be invested to upgrade it. So I think that they are doing what they can, and they probably need a bit more funding, possibly from central government, to overcome that hurdle. So maybe that's again a central policy decision to invest more heavily in the grid to enable that to happen.
Absolutely. And finally, just conscious of time, Zoe, and then we can wrap.
So I'm going to go for a very big policy thing, and that's that I think we need to collectively lobby government for a carbon tax that then reinvests and uses that money into local authorities so that local authorities could then lead mass retrofit both in the private and local sector. That would be my big policy here.
Yeah. And enable that recirculating fund to stay within the council so that you can
Totally.
reinvest it. Yeah,
exactly.
Completely agree.
Local area.
Good.
£50. I mean, and this just goes back to the education piece. If any government at the moment tried to put a £50 carbon tax on, they would probably get kicked out of government immediately. But if every student in the country knew the importance of this and stopped their parents voting for the wrong people, it might get pushed through. That's why the importance of education.
Yeah, pest to power its best, kids get
Absolutely.
Parents. So thank you. So we're about out of time now. Thanks very much to everyone on the panel. It's been really great talking to you and some really valuable insights. To everyone that's registered and logged on, we will be circulating a copy of the recording and links to any resources that we've talked about. So thanks very much to everyone. Really appreciate their time. And London Climate Action Week continues till the 3rd. So if you've got more events, then enjoy. And if not, enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Great to
you.
meet you.
Bye all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.